This is 1968, all the rage.
It was a year of war, revolution, racial tensions, and political tumult. Yet when many of us think back to 1968, our minds fly first to the clothes we wore, the food we ate, the toys we played with, and the commercials that persuaded us to buy it all. All the things that were all the rage. Over the next hour, we'll examine the fads and trends, movements and manias that shaped the year and that in many ways shape us still.
In 1968, fashion's only convention was the unconventional, as designers took inspiration from a youth culture that was itself in constant flux. Throughout the 1950s and on into the 60s, fashion had been synonymous with sophisticated glamour, as epitomized by the Spanish designer Cristobal Balenciaga.
Balenciaga was the greatest couturier in the world. When ladies would meet him, they actually curtsied. He could take a little old lady stooped over and hunchbacked and construct a dress that would make her look young and tall and straight. It took a very long time and it cost a lot of money. So by 1968, we were turning 18 at 50,000 people a day, and they couldn't afford those kind of things.
As the youth market became the dominant force in fashion, it wasn't just the looks that changed, it was the way clothes were marketed and sold.
Ready-to-wear was the big trend in 1968. In Paris, it was called prêt-à-porter, which sounds a little more glamorous.
Almost overnight, the ideal of fashion changed from elegant, sophisticated couture to breezy, casual chic.
Well, it was the youthquake of that time that influenced the style. And, it really changed the look of fashion totally.
There was general prosperity, there were allowances, and absolutely a compulsion to have the latest.
Streamlined and avant-garde looks still walked the runways, but bohemian chic ruled the streets.
In 1968, we were all fascinated by getting to the moon, but the trend was changing to the floppy hats and the beards on the men and beads. There was the gypsy look that was very big.
I would describe my 60s style as rather colourful hippie. You're talking about a different kind of gorgeousness from, say, the hard-edged things of the early period of the 60s.
The new, younger looks required a new breed of faces and figures to sell them.
Girls are to look even more like boys. Well, that's the message from Twiggy, the beanpole model girl who's turned into a fashion tycoon.
Suddenly fashion went very young and they didn't have any very young models. All the models were very sophisticated, beautiful, elegant ladies. Suddenly Mary Quant, Barbara Houlinicki were popping up in London designing all these teenage clothes. They didn't have any girls.
And as the clothing became younger and more daring, so did the hairstyles.
In '68, the Vidal Sassoon look was very in, very popular. The short hair was very liberating. It was very easy to take care of.
The line in '68 was fascinating because we'd gone through the 5-point cut, we'd gone through the short bobs, and then people wanted their hair slightly longer. So there were two bobs, one with a very long back and a short side, and the other one with a short back and long sides. And again, it created a whole other mood.
While women cut their hair, men let theirs grow, following the example of the Beatles, who were as influential in style as they were in music.
You look at the Beatles films and what they're wearing is a fashion.
In 1968, the Fab Four went to India to study with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, triggering a brief fashion craze that found men wearing the Indian-inspired Nehru jacket. But other attempts to give men the kind of looser, freer fashions women enjoyed didn't quite catch on. In fact, the trend in men's clothing was towards an almost anonymous hippie uniformity.
What I recall most about 1968 was that everyone, whether they'd been in the military or not, and mostly not, everyone seemed to adopt an olive drab look to their wardrobe. The olive drab shirt over a t-shirt or whatever. It was almost the year of anti-fashion.
The opposite sex was luckier. The more casual styles driven by teenagers gave a new freedom to adult women.
1968 was the advent of the pantsuit, and every woman was running around in pantsuit. It made us feel strong, to wear blazers and pants. It was the beginning of women's liberation, and we were just starting to realize that we could do anything a man could do.
They wore boots all of a sudden, and they wore, pants all the time, and sweaters, and a much more relaxed look. I remember Mrs. Onassis, who was Mrs. Kennedy in those days, came to me and wanted to look like a woman on the street. She didn't want to look like, Mrs. Kennedy.
In 1968, the midi skirt was introduced, and I was chosen by Life magazine to model 3 of them. It didn't go over too well with the men. We wanted to be mature women and be taken seriously. We could be taken a lot more seriously in a long skirt.
But the year's biggest fashion success was a simple white dress.
From the tiny chapel on the Greek island of Skorpios, the first public appearance of Mrs. Aristotle Onassis, formerly, of course, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, widow of the late president.
That dress was not made for the wedding. Jackie wore almost exclusively Valentino. So earlier in the year, she had ordered 6 white dresses, or off-white dresses, just for her wardrobe. And when it came time to get married, she just picked one of them out of her closet. Well, the dress just took off. Literally millions were sold at every level. So it was the most popular wedding dress in the world, I guess.
From Jackie's classic white simplicity to the hippies' cascades of color, 1968's greatest fashion statements were as individual as they were irresistible. Coming up, the youthquake that changed fashion moves indoors. Plus, beanbag chairs, lava lamps, and more when our look at what was all the rage in 1968 continues.
We had a revolutionary youth trying to change the world, and they really revolutionized interior design in a lot of ways.
The boldness and innovation of 1968 design wasn't confined to clothes. It was in the walls, halls, and even the carpets of the houses around us. In the early 60s, the predominant home decor trend was sleek, spare, and streamlined, with ideas inspired by the space program.
Kaza Khan had designed those transparent blow-up chairs.
But the more exaggerated style of the youth movement resulted in bolder shapes, textures, and patterns.
Interior design often mirrors what's going on in society around us. And that drove a look indoors that was very energetic and vibrant to match the energy that pushes societal change. A great example of that is the conversation pit. That was actually designed in 1957 by Eero Saarinen, and then it percolated up to the national consciousness, and it became very, very popular in 1968.
London-based David Nightingale Hicks was the most influential designer of the year.
He threw out the rule book. He combined all sorts of furnishings that would have never been put in the same room before. For example, he would put fine French antiques with the latest plastic chair. No one had ever done that.
Hicks also pioneered the bold use of color, which was splashed all over the furniture, walls, and carpets of 1968.
He was famous for putting together red and orange, purple and yellow, all sorts of bold combinations that were never done before, and he actually called those vibrating colors, which I think reflects the energy that we all felt in the mid-1960s.
Designers too often neglect the necessity of atmosphere, character, contrast, and pattern.
David Hicks' carpet designs are what has really lasted the longest. He brought them to America in 1968, but they're the bold, geometric, mesmerizing patterns that were driven possibly by the mind-blowing drug culture influence that was prevalent during 1968. He was so popular that he did movie sets. There was a Julie Christie movie that came out in 1968.
You told the policeman you had a dizzy spell?
Right. I fell on my bottom.
People saw those interiors on the movies, and that drove interior design.
David Hicks' vibrating colors had their counterpart in the more natural hues adopted by the youth movement.
The earth tones, the avocados, the cinnamons, the more bohemian looks. Some of that was really started in the late 1950s when Scandinavian design became popular. And then the hippie culture that was looking for something a little less formal, a little looser, that fed right into that.
You know, I don't know if shag carpeting was youth-driven. I don't know who we should prosecute for that, but that was probably one of the more horrible things that ever happened to home decor.
Shag carpeting was one of those trends that happened progressively. The hippies were having their love-ins and sitting on the grass and had their flowers in their hair, and shag carpeting was a metaphor for that as well.
The hippie influence on interior design wasn't limited to more relaxed textures and natural colors. The mind-altering experiments of 1968's Flower Children also played a role.
The op art influence came out in the bold patterns and also in some of the psychedelic colors and some of the geometrics that were very popular at the time, and kind of clashing colors that came out. And that was really driven by an artist, Victor Vasarely. He did a lot of optical illusion type art, and that found its way in our carpeting and then again in even some of our rooms.
In 1968, the two major design trends, space age and bohemian, took chairs in entirely different directions. First, with the hanging bubble chair.
Aero Arneo launched that in 1968, and it's the perfect metaphor for the swinging 60s because it's an indoor swing. Not only that, the sitter actually appears as if they're floating in space. And finally, it's shaped like the moon, and we were striving so hard to reach the moon in 1968.
1968's second seated reinvention was the beanbag chair.
That is a classic example of rejecting establishment. I mean, chairs are supposed to have legs, they're supposed to have arms, they're supposed to have a seat, and the beanbag chair had none of that. So that made it revolutionary in and of itself. Secondly, the beanbag chair is almost a metaphor for the sexual revolution. To get comfortable in the beanbag chair, it has to embrace your body.
Beanbags inexplicably are still with us, and I never got the appeal of that. You know, maybe it's a lifetime of arthritis.
1968 also saw the debut of the flower pot lamp, which reflected both the space program and the counterculture.
It was an example of how we were fascinated with globe shapes. We were looking from outer space down at the Earth. We were striving to go up to the moon. And so that lamp is really designed with precise mathematical calculations.
One of 1968's oddest home decor innovations makes perfect sense when you consider how well it reflects the year of its birth.
Society was erupting like a volcano. We had assassinations, terrible ones, riots, the Cold War. And so, interestingly, the lamp that captured everyone's imagination was a lamp that showed lava erupting. Another interesting thing about the lava lamp is that it's an early example of mood lighting. It really didn't shed any light. What could be more counterculture than a lamp that doesn't illuminate?
The new, playful, relaxed interior design marked a turn in attitudes that would only grow stronger in the years to come.
When there's a revolution in society, it mirrors directly back into our homes, and that's what happened in 1968.
Coming up, new fast food restaurants expand beyond burgers, and McDonald's fights back with the biggest burger yet. Plus, a television chef heats up French cooking when our look at what was all the rage in 1968 continues.
There was a big transition with a lot of things going on in this world, and food was certainly one of them. McDonald's and the other brands had taken over, and they were never going to let go.
In 1968, the pace of life and the power of the youth market combined to revolutionize the fast food business.
Initially in the 60s, all of the fast food places are traditional burger places because based on the McDonald's successful model that Ray Kroc pioneered throughout the country. You can get a burger, you can get fries, you can get a drink, maybe a shake, and that was really it. Before this time, I mean, pizza and tacos were really regionalized. I mean, you couldn't get a great taco or a great piece of pizza in a lot of the Midwest, for example. But that changed a lot in the 60s. You had pizza through Pizza Hut, you had fish and chips through Arthur Treacher's, you had a variety of options.
The new public craving for different kinds of food even impacted traditional restaurants, inspiring a chain that first opened its doors in 1968.
Red Lobster made its mark bringing seafood to places in this country that just hadn't seen it on a regular basis.
With the new specialty food chains crowding the market, McDonald's had to come up with something to make burgers exciting again. And did they ever?
This is the sandwich. McDonald's new Big Mac sandwich for the bigger than average appetite.
The Big Mac came on the scene in 1968. It was started actually by a McDonald's franchisee named Jim Delgatti out in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. And what Jim did was he decided to put 2 burgers and 2 patties together and make a monster of a sandwich that could also serve as a full meal. All of a sudden, his sales were tremendous. And Ray Kroc and the McDonald's crew, being as smart as they were, knew they had something special.
The Big Mac helped keep McDonald's on top of the fast food industry, but it also gave competitors a success story to imitate.
All of a sudden, every other chain wants to have their own Big Mac. But as different knockoffs started around the country, none of them had the cachet of the Big Mac. And that's where you have to give McDonald's advertising and marketing a lot of credit. They were the advertisers who really said, hey, there's something we can do here to get adults excited, to get kids excited, and have people want to come see Ronald McDonald and enjoy our product on a repeat basis.
And now to get my flying hamburger started.
The key in the fast food business was children's advertising. Parents would say, okay, we're going to go out for dinner. The kid would then make a decision which restaurant chain you would go to.
It was the kid saying, hey, I want my Big Mac and my fries, or I want to go visit the Colonel, or whatever it might be.
The spread of fast food franchises was the result of a carefully calibrated plan of national and eventually global domination.
The McDonald's Corporation really had put a lot of science into studying how food is ordered, how it can best be distributed, how it can best be manufactured.
The key to a lot of these fast food franchise success was the brand. And remember, this is the late 60s. Branding, it's there in cars maybe, and cigarettes, but it's not really in food until McDonald's and KFC came along. And with McDonald's, you weren't just getting a burger, you were getting an experience.
As fast food became increasingly commercialized, emphasizing convenience more than cuisine, home cooking followed suit.
Yes, giblet gravy and sliced turkey, together in the most significant frozen dish of our time, buffet supper.
But a reaction to fast food and frozen dinners had taken root, and in the unlikeliest of places, on public television and on the bestseller list. The PBS cooking show The French Chef had become a surprise hit, and a major part of the show's appeal was its host, Julia Child.
She didn't like the title. She always claimed that she was not a chef. She said she was a home cook. She was teaching people how to cook French cuisine at home.
I was very lucky being the only person cooking on television.
She became famous because she was natural. She was a mature woman. She wasn't threatening. She was easy. If she dropped something on the kitchen top or the counter, that was fine.
When you flip anything, you just have to have the courage of your convictions, particularly if it's sort of a loose mass like this. Well, that didn't go very well.
You could do the same. That was the implication.
In a fast food culture, Child made slow cooking more like a challenge than a chore.
People wanted to, maybe try something a little bit more involved than the usual kind of steak and potatoes. This other food that we see the preparation of on television, we try to mimic. That's something special. That's to create an event.
it turned out there was a big and enthusiastic audience there, because our cooking in this country had been very simple and kind of basic. And now people were very much interested in French cuisine.
In 1968, Child published the companion book to the series. The French Chef Cookbook was one of 1968's major publishing successes, with 12 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list. It also helped bring about the home cooking and regional cuisine renaissance of the 1970s.
Julia is very much involved in triggering the food revolution in terms of broadening it, making it personal. I mean, look at how far we've come since then.
Whether delegating meal times to fast food or finding fresh adventure in cooking, 1968's new trends in food transformed our relationship with our kitchens. Coming up, the world's favorite fashion doll gets a 1968 makeover. Plus, Hot Wheels zoom onto the scene, literally, when our look at what was all the rage in 1968 continues.
The toy industry has always been an industry that reflects the culture. It doesn't really lead the culture.
1968's youth movement was driven by newly empowered teens, but children saw it happening, and toy manufacturers responded by updating their products to reflect the new reality.
The 1959 Barbie had that cat eye, that very sort of elegant look, and she had two options in her life: model or bride. I mean, that was it. That was it. Well, you know, fast forward 9 years later to 1968, the role of women in culture has changed. So Mattel revamped Barbie, gave her a new look, that whole California beach idea.
She's the very same size, but now she comes with a groovy outdoor look. And Barbie's lashes are really for real.
Barbie's constantly evolved as a toy, not just as a cultural icon, so talking was really important.
I love being a fashion model. Who's that? That was my new cousin Barbie.
Having friends, having a place to go, you know, a beach house, a dream house, a car, pets.
The addition of Christie in 1968 was to prove more revolutionary than previous Barbie friends.
She was the first African-American doll in the line.
Barbie wasn't the only classic toy adapting to the times. Her action figure counterpart was making equally significant changes.
G.I. Joe came out in 1964. The executives at Hasbro saw how girls were interacting with Barbie, and they said there's got to be a way to do that for boys. So we had Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. Fast forward to 1968, you had the Korean standoff at the beginning of the year. You had the Tet Offensive in Vietnam later in the year, and we started to see G.I. Joe changing, because as the culture was less and less accepting of the Vietnam War, G.I. Joe actually started to morph into sort of a different kind of action figure.
But it was Elliot Handler, the co-founder of Mattel, who scored the year's biggest toy success.
Well, it was his thought that since they held such a big marketplace with the Barbie doll, and it was a girl's toy, why couldn't they do the same thing with boys' toys? And since Mattel is in California, and you have to consider the years, everything was American muscle car. I mean, the big Chevelles were out, the Mustangs, the Corvettes, and they all looked at that and they said, you know what, this might be a place to go.
And the challenge with previous cars before, toy cars, Matchbox, Corgi, Tonka, some of those, is they weren't really built for speed.
They decided that they wanted to have cars that exuded power.
They're new. They're authentic. They're the fastest miniature metal cars you've ever seen.
Matchbox had emphasized sort of your dad's car, automobiles of yesteryear, things like that. And these were the cars that every kid aspired to have. They were the muscle cars, the speed cars, the cars that would drive by on the street and kids would go, whoa!
They were called Hot Wheels, and they involved more sheer engineering than any previous toy car.
The first go-around with Hot Wheels had axles that were bent a certain way, and when you stepped on the car or you pushed it down, it had suspension, and the wheels would go up inside the body just like a real car, and that was pretty cool. Plus, they were piano wires, so they wouldn't bend very easy. because you can imagine what the rough treatment a Hot Wheel would get. It had suspension, it had rolling, it had looks, it had everything.
It also had something entirely new, its own track.
It was what's now the iconic orange track, and they also introduced the propelling things, which was basically two wheels wrapped in foam that spun around, battery operated. When the car went through it, it shot it down the track.
Mattel grossly underestimated the amount of sales that they were going to have. They estimated sales to be only at 16 million, and it ended up to be 7 times the estimate.
Hot Wheels ruled the toy market in 1968, but a wide variety of highly inventive board games also made an impact, and they all had one thing in common.
What really made Battleship so successful was its TV commercial. I mean, it became sort of something kids said throughout playgrounds was, "You sunk my battleship."
Oh, you sunk my battleship.
In fact, commercials were the primary way advertisers reached kids in 1968.
Toys had never been advertised. There was a brief advertising period at Christmas. And then there was no toy advertising the rest of the year until Mattel came in. Our Los Angeles office was producing, at its height, 60 Barbie commercials a year.
But Barbie's the doll with lots of friends of her own. They're Stacy and Christy.
What's playing at the cinema? Shall we go? Let's go shopping with Barbie.
And then with Hot Wheels followed on.
Television just created new levels of want and greed in that just made kids want more all the time. It was relentless.
You can get 3 different Fun Gum toys. Dr. Doolittle's Fun Gum Animals, Fun Gum Monsters, Fun Gum Bird.
The power of TV at that time was really significant, how they created demand and knowledge of the toy. So it really was how they got kids to want, see, and ask for them.
To have peace in the household, parents would probably go out and buy lots of things they wouldn't normally buy, or certainly wouldn't buy if they were in their right minds.
The increased attention to children was part of the larger youth movement and the growing power of the younger generations.
Children, especially the baby boomers, were having a bigger voice in the culture. We started to see the role of the child as an individual, not just sort of an add-on to the parents, begin to emerge.
Toys were changing their function in 1968 from being merely playthings to shapers of the generation to come. Coming up, magazines are transformed by a new breed of superstar editors like Cosmopolitan's Helen Gurley Brown. Plus, Stan Lee remakes Marvel Comics in his own image when our look at what was all the rage in 1968 continues. In 1968, we were dramatically changing how we dressed, how we decorated, and how we ate. We were also changing how we kept up with it all, as a new trend in magazines became all the rage.
A successful magazine, as defined in the late 60s, was really an extension of the personality of its founder or editor.
When the 60s began, the most popular magazines were glossy general interest publications. But by 1968, the magazine landscape was very different.
Television had really changed everything by now. It had taken away the advertising from Life and Look and the Saturday Evening Post. Why would you advertise one page in the Saturday Evening Post when you could get 30 seconds on NBC?
The new trend was magazines with a strong point of view, often one individual's point of view.
Those were the ones that became much more successful as the 60s went on. Playboy and Rolling Stone and Cosmopolitan and so forth.
Playboy, founded by Hugh Hefner in 1953, kick-started the trend, and by the mid-60s, Hefner was an international celebrity, with his legacy thriving on newsstands everywhere.
Relaxed urban living, good food and drink, pretty girls, good entertainment.
Rolling Stone, founded in 1967 by Jan Wenner, was expanding beyond its rock journalism focus to reflect its young publishers' political and cultural ideals.
We were covering politics from the very beginning of the magazine.
In '68, it was more about, the New Left and student politics and all that stuff.
In fashion magazines, the most prominent presence was Diana Vreeland, the autocratic editor of Vogue.
She was one of the most amazing people I ever met. She wore rouge all around the edge of her face, and she had this inner belief in herself. And, her sayings are ones that are always remembered, like pink is the navy blue of India.
Vreeland revolutionized not merely Vogue, but all of fashion publishing by insisting that photography, layout, format, even typesetting were as important as the clothes. She created an aesthetic that is still in use today.
We talk all the time about people who are legendary, and very few of them really are. And she is. She's such an original.
Vreeland's Vogue was an aspirational magazine for women, but a different kind of magazine was needed to serve the everyday needs of the new class of women who were living on their own.
Cosmopolitan had been around since the turn of the 20th century, but it was reinvented in the early 60s under the editor Helen Gurley Brown, who made it a magazine for single working women.
Brown was a forward thinker who in 1962 had written a bestseller called Sex and the Single Girl. She recognized that working women were the wave of the future.
No one was staying home with daddy and mommy anymore until they got married. The number of working women had doubled since the mid-1950s. Her first issue in 1965, part and parcel of her success, was an article called "Oh, What a Lovely Pill," and that was the birth control pill.
Brown not only rebranded the magazine, she created a new brand of woman, the Cosmo Girl, a name she stuck with even in the face of feminist criticism.
I just think of women as girls in some respects, and the cosmopolitan woman sounds rather austere and stern and very self-important.
Her instincts were solid. By 1968, the magazine's ad pages had tripled and circulation had skyrocketed.
She absolutely was the queen of the specialty publication.
While most of 1968's high-profile editors were responsible for a single magazine, one editor was the voice and the face of an entire line. In the early 60s, Stan Lee had reinvented the declining Marvel Comics imprint.
Stan decided to take a flyer and try writing comics for a little older audience. He figured, well, he'd keep the language simple enough for the juveniles, but he would start giving the characters, well, character. They would disagree with each other, which the heroes over at DC, like Superman and Batman, rarely did. There were romances, there were arguments, they were fighting. You weren't quite sure sometimes if they were heroes or villains. They seemed to go back and forth.
The heroes were broken. They were decrepit. They were gamma-rayed. They killed people. Spider-Man was the cause of his uncle's dying and had to redeem himself. All these characters were flawed characters.
The whole formula, if there was one, I think, was to say, let's assume that somebody really could walk on walls like Spider-Man or turn green and become a monster like the Hulk. Wouldn't he still have to worry about making a living, or people distrusting him, or having acne and dandruff, or his girlfriend jilting him, or what are the real problems people would have?
College students and high school students said, yeah, well, that's a much better turn on heroes. Heroes that are flawed. We like that because guess what? I'm flawed.
The new, older readership wrote to Marvel's letters pages, and Lee replied in his own snappy, irreverent voice, making his own image synonymous with the company's.
Then he needed something beyond the letters pages, something where he could also be plugging the other comics and just talking about whatever he felt he should talk about. Go off on a tangent about bigotry or whatever, he would do that. And in those bullpen bulletins, he began to make the people who worked in the bullpen into individuals. First he gave them nicknames. He was originally Smilin' Stan Lee, and then sometimes Stan the Man Lee. There was Jolly Jack Kirby, who very quickly became Jack King Kirby, which was an even better name for him. As soon as I walked in, I became Rascally Roy Thomas. I was anything but rascally at that stage in my life.
In 1968, Marvel expanded its line, including new titles aimed at even older readers, like The Silver Surfer and Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.
The Silver Surfer was the first one of the characters that I think really seemed alien. He was this interesting character. He was trying to discover what the human race was like. And S.H.I.E.L.D. was this organization that in the age of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and the James Bond movies. Jim Steranko was a young artist. He was psychedelic drawing. He would just throw in any sort of weird layout. There'd be all sorts of spirals on a page.
The company's growth alarmed the industry leader.
DC Comics was frustrated because Marvel seemed to know how to hire new artists. They were doing new things all the time, driving DC Comics crazy, and then they kind of tapped me to do Deadman.
Neil Adams' detailed, innovative work on DC's new supernatural superhero series caused such a sensation that DC allowed him to revitalize Batman, whose sales had been languishing since the TV show ended earlier in 1968. Adams' more vital, kinetic version propelled the character into the 70s.
The truth is that when that television show went on, everybody loved it. I loved it. But it wasn't Batman and Robin. Batman and Robin was this mysterious guy that went out at night and fought crime.
While Marvel Comics was creating a kind of folk literature for the late 60s, one maverick journalist was borrowing from comic book sensibility to write what many consider the defining book of the era.
Tom Wolfe had come from a kind of a traditional journalistic background, but he ended up at the New York Herald Tribune in 1962, and that's when all the real fun began, because he began to revolutionize the approach to newspaper writing, using all kinds of sound effects and pyrotechnic devices, and I call it zip, zam, zowie, and swoosh. He came up with the phrase pandemonium with a big grin to describe the 60s. And so when he set about to write what he hoped would be the great book of the 1960s, he looked around for a subject. And the subject was the spiritual quest of the writer Ken Kesey, who had written One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Sometimes a Great Notion, and that appeared to go off the rails somewhat. And Tom Wolfe was intent on chronicling this guy's spiritual journey through the 1960s.
The result was the electric Kool-Aid acid test, which caused a sensation when it was published in 1968.
I think what he did was to kind of capture the essence of the time. Ken Kesey was kind of living the American dream. He was the next Hemingway. He was the great American novelist. He had it all, but that wasn't enough. And so he went on a spiritual vision quest and took a lot of other people with him. His associates called the Merry Pranksters, kind of the patient zero for the species we came to know as hippie.
You only come to this movie once, and if you don't get something rewarding out of every minute you're sitting there, then you're blowing your ticket.
And that, to me, was the great story of the 60s, the fact that you could have everything and it still wasn't enough.
Tom Wolfe and the great magazine editors captured imaginations in 1968, but they captured something else, a larger sense of American life that makes them still vital and still readable today. Coming up, advertising hits new heights in a fast-growing medium. Plus, the new commercialism triggers a countercultural backlash when our look at what was all the rage in 1968 continues.
The 60s were a great time in the advertising business. It was a golden age.
At the dawn of the decade, advertising was still focused primarily on magazines and newspapers. And while print advertising made great stylistic strides in the 60s, the real creative revolution happened elsewhere.
Television had just started to come in a big way, and we didn't know how to get people on camera and off camera. As we got more familiar with television, as we got more expert in it, it became more creative.
It's new. It's now. It's Flash Cue.
With only 30 seconds to work with, advertisers had to think in a whole new way.
We learned how to compress the message and boil it down, and with just a little bit of a suggestion, convey a range of attitudes and emotions.
Commercials also adopted recurring characters and catchphrases that became as familiar to viewers as the casts of their favorite sitcoms, like the Maytag Repairman, The Loneliest Man in Town, and Palmolive's Madge the Manicurist.
Softens your hands while you do the dishes. You're soaking in it. Dishwashing liquid.
In 1968, there was a feline addition to the ranks.
Watch me be finicky.
Some 9 lives, dear?
Uh-oh.
Through the innovative use of images, slogans, and jingles, commercials increasingly defined the era.
You've come a long way, baby, to get where you got to today.
1968's renaissance in TV advertising even made the cover of Time magazine. But as advertisers perfected their vision of a shiny new society with products for every need, the younger generation rebelled, creating an anti-materialistic counterculture.
Advertisers wanted to give their products a first-class ticket through life, and so they would associate these products with certain elements of the lifestyle. But the counterculture didn't necessarily aspire to the traditional objects. We didn't bow and scrape before the normal gods of capitalism.
We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life, a simple life, a good life, you know, and think about moving the whole human race ahead a step.
In rejecting materialism, the hippies of the counterculture famously turned to Eastern religions and mind-altering substances.
The emphasis about spiritual seeking or LSD or drugs, that's kind of the sideshow, and that really what's going on is a rebellion against the middle-class sexual norms that had been around probably since Victorian times.
The hippies are capable of extremely hard work, even though they tend to approach work as the rest of us do sport.
By 1968, the counterculture had produced money-making ventures in areas like publishing.
That is a big business, the underground press. Those kinds of publications had huge circulations.
In 1968, cartoonist Robert Crumb self-published the first issue of Zap Comics.
C-O-M-I-X, comics, because they were X-rated. They had to be sold at the cash register in a round envelope. You couldn't sell them openly because they were considered obscene at the time.
The continued success of Zap Comics inspired a flourishing underground comics market, and the rest of the counterculture ended up similarly feeding the very enemy it had risen up against.
Once there's dollars involved in this, there's a huge market there. And so, of course, Madison Avenue plays up this, and the department stores start carrying hippie jewelry, sometimes actually hippie jewelry made by hippies.
Trademarks of hippie resistance, like the flower power and peace symbols, were eagerly embraced by the mainstream and inevitably used to sell products.
Hippies were never a majority of the population, and they were never a majority of 20-year-olds. So mass culture won, because mass culture wins. I mean, that's the kind of society we live in. Of course, in the process, mass culture itself was changed.
In fact, the counterculture is responsible for many mainstream trends that are still all the rage today.
The rise of natural foods, the belief that you should eat local, the aesthetics, the use of flamboyant color. In many ways, the issue is, when did the 60s end? And the answer is, well, maybe the 60s didn't end and it's still going on.
(1968) was a hinge point in history. And while we strive to understand it through its conflicts, convulsions, assassinations, and innovations, there's just as much to be learned from its fashions, passions, crazes, and rages. That'll do it for us today. I'm Carrie Sayers. As we leave, one last look at what was all the rage in the year 1968.